All right, well, here is the notes for Friday's class. Sorry I'm not able to be with you guys, but I'm at a conference up in Orange County presenting some research I've done over the past year. So this video will take place of class that we're having on Friday. So today we're talking about muscle force generation, twitch, tetanus, and motor units. So these are some important key concepts about how skeletal muscle works. So let's start out with this question, and this has to do with what's called the length-tension relationship in muscle. If we were to compare these three positions, position A being fully extended, okay, so we're talking about the biceps muscle here, and we're talking about this elbow being fully extended here, okay, and then position C would be right in the middle, okay, so we've got kind of a 90-degree angle here in the elbows, okay. And then we have position B, which is almost fully flexed. Okay, so this puts the muscle at different angles. And so the question that you guys would do, and if I had you there in class, I would have you do this with the people around you, have you do a bicep curl with the person next to you in these three different positions, and have your partner try to resist you and see which position produces the most force. So, yeah, so I want you to try that, think about that. And really, since we're here on the video, I'm just going to give you the answer. But the answer is going to be this one right here, the one right in the middle. So position C. And the reason for that is something called the length-tension relationship of muscle. And I will explain that to you here in a second. All right, so the length-tension relationship goes like this. Again, we've got that actin and myosin that we've been talking about. Okay, and when those myosin heads interacting with actin is really what gives us force. Okay, so when those myosin heads pull back, they have to be connected to actin to give us force. Okay, so we have all of these little myosin heads coming off of actin, or sorry, coming off of myosin here. Okay, and so we got a bunch of them like this. I'm making some annotations down here on sarcomere C, so you can see that. So all these little myosin heads sticking up. So in this case, in sarcomere C, in this overly stretched, so this would be the fully extended position, we have a bunch of myosin heads that aren't actually touching actin. All right? All these myosin heads out here, they're moving, but they're not doing anything. They're not helping us produce any force, so we don't get as much force that way. Okay? And then the example here in sarcomere A, this is a problem because sarcomeres can't shorten any further than this. They only have a little bit of room left in here, and they're kind of smashed together. So when those sarcomeres try to go further together, they just don't move anymore. Okay, and then our third option here, sarcomere B, and the one that would represent right in the middle on the previous slide, is we have the max number of myosin heads touching actin, and we still have a good amount of room to shorten. All right, yeah, so just to kind of help solidify that a little bit, that spot right in the middle would be our spot with the most force production possible. So let's kind of look at that and see exactly what's happening here. So with that fully shortened position, we have too much overlap, interference with actin and myosin. It can't shorten any further. If we're fully lengthened, then not all the myosin heads are actually touching actin, so they're not contributing to the force production, and we don't get as much force. And then right in the middle, we have optimal overlap of myosin and actin, maximal force generation, also because there's room for it to shorten. Okay, so another related concept, but a different concept, is the relationship between how much load we put on a muscle and how fast that muscle can contract. So there's kind of three different options here, and you can do this on yourself, again, using your biceps to do elbow flexion if you'd like. So the first option here is no added load or light load. Okay, so that would just be holding your arm out straight, and then just flex your elbow up, like do a quick bicep curl as fast as you can. And so no load at all. You can do a very fast contraction, right? The next option would be when the load matches force production. When the load matches force production, that is when there's no movement at all, right? And that no movement at all, you could do this by doing a bicep curl underneath your desk or something like that, to where you just push as hard as you can, but no movement happens. Later we're going to talk about how that's called an isometric contraction with no movement. And then the third option is when the load is heavier than the muscle can carry. So you're holding something very heavy in your arm, in your hand, or someone's pushing down against you doing a bicep curl, and they actually push harder than the force you can produce. So your muscle starts lengthening actually, even though it's still contracting. Okay, and this is an example of what are called eccentric contractions. All right, and you can play around with this on yourself. Okay, so a little bit about fatigue. Okay, so fatigue is kind of this concept that obviously means that you pushed yourself so hard, as far as pushing your muscle and your whole body exercise so hard that you can't go anymore. Okay, and there's really two general concepts in fatigue. The first concept is called central fatigue, and that would pretty much mean that there's something in your brain actually forcing you to stop exercising or forcing you to not allow yourself to push any harder. Okay, and so the idea with that is that your brain is sensing something out in the periphery, so sensing something going on in the muscle, maybe sensing low oxygen levels or depletion of glycogen or something like that, and then your brain saying, all right, we don't like how that feels, we're going to shut you off from exercising, right? We're going to make you stop exercising, we're not going to let you push any further. So that would be central fatigue. Peripheral fatigue would be if things are just malfunctioning in the periphery. Okay, so maybe it's where your nervous system connects to your skeletal muscle. Maybe there's buildup of so much acid in that area that it blocks the connection between the nerves and the muscle. Or maybe there's actually some buildup of acid or buildup of some other things in the skeletal muscle that's getting in the way of actin and myosin binding to each other, and that would actually stop force production. Or maybe there's things getting in the way of the mitochondria creating ATP. So those would be all problems out in the periphery, and your brain's trying to get your muscle to contract, but it just can't because there's a problem there. Okay, so one example of central fatigue is this study where they used something called the avatar, and I have this picture of the cyclist up here because it was kind of like this, except for instead of just having the picture of the cyclist on the computer screen in front of him, he also had a little avatar next to him. Okay, so like a little hologram image of a cyclist next to him. And so there was a study where they used this kind of hologram cyclist image. It's kind of the most high-tech version of a bike trainer like this that you can get. And what they did is they had all the subjects were professional cyclists. They had them come in on 3 separate occasions. The first time they had them come in, and they did something called the time trial, where they they had them go a certain distance on the bike, and they told them just to push it as hard as they possibly could. And these were trained cyclists, so they knew how hard to push themselves, and they pushed it as hard as they could for that certain distance that they had to go, and they noted their time. And then they had them, and then the researchers also noted how much power output they were able to do on the bike, how hard they were pushing it the whole time during that time trial period. And then they came in 2 times after that. One time, first of all, I'll say that both times they came in, the cyclists thought that the avatar that was going to be next to them was paced at their exact same pace that they did during the time trial. Okay, so all the same points were going at that avatar was going the exact same speed, exact same power output as the cyclist was on that very first visit. And so that's what the cyclist was told. But in truth, one time that was true, and the avatar was set at the exact same pace. But then the other time, that avatar was actually set at 5% higher power output. And the interesting thing was the cyclists always were able to keep up with the avatar in both occasions, when he was at his 100% of max, and also when he was at 105% of max. And then the interesting thing was they actually looked at the physiology of that to see what was going on, and what they noticed is the cyclists were able to tap into this stored energy reserve that would push them a little bit further into acid building up in their body, a little bit further into depleting energy stores, but the brain allowed them to do that when the brain thought that they were actually at a pace that they should be able to maintain. And so kind of just shows a good example of central fatigue. Okay, so the main causes of fatigue, and there's lots of them. There's lots of different causes depending on what type of exercise you're doing. Okay, there could be depletion of ATP. Typically doesn't really happen, but it could happen in really high intense situations of exercise. Depletion of glycogen. If we're talking about a long, intense bout of exercise, something over an hour, greater than 1 hour, then we might see some glycogen depletion. And then this is a very important point having to do with fatigue. When that muscle glycogen starts to run out, remember that's stored glucose. When that starts to run out, the body starts shutting off exercise. That's a very bad situation for the body to be in, to not have that stored glycogen, so it starts shutting things off. Also, we have buildup of metabolites, and these are typically byproducts of doing exercise. Okay, so if we have a buildup of the hydrogen ion from one of the systems that the body uses to create ATP, that builds up, that shuts things off. Buildup of potassium, that has to do with the way that nerves activate muscles and activate other parts of the body, and then also buildup of calcium, and that has to do with muscle contraction, as we already talked about. So all of these things are kind of what's known as a negative feedback loop, where we need these things to do certain activities, but if we have too much of them, then it actually shuts things off. Another important factor is when the muscle gets too hot, and that happens when we're breaking down ATP, contracting muscle, we produce a lot of heat. So all of these things get in the way of us exercising more, and might lead to fatigue. Okay, so a couple other issues having to do with muscle. Number one is called muscle tone. And so as you're sitting here listening to this video and watching it, you're probably at least sitting up, and so you're using muscles in your back, right? You're using muscles in your neck to hold yourself up, maybe using muscles in your arms to hold your arms in a certain posture. You don't have to think about that, and you're not even really thinking about contracting your muscle, but your muscles are just at a constant low level of contraction to keep you upright. Okay, and the interesting part about this is it's all controlled by spinal reflexes, meaning that your brain is not necessary to keep that level of muscle tone that you have just to maintain posture. Okay, so how can we constantly be contracting muscle and not fatigue? Well, the interesting part is what happens is the body is rotating which muscle cells are being used. Okay, and so instead of just same muscle cells being contracting all the time, there's certain ones that go, and then they get to take a break, and then other ones kick in. Those ones get to take a break, other ones kick in, and eventually those initial ones rotate back in. And so, for example, just in a small muscle like the biceps brachii, there's about 250,000 muscle cells. But we have much, much larger muscle cells than that, so we get to kind of rotate through those and maintain constant force. So the purposes for this muscle tone are posture, like I've been talking about, also helping us keep our joints stable, and also keeping the muscle ready to respond and contract. So it needs to be kind of have a little bit of tension on it for us to be able to contract rapidly and move our body if we need to, if we're in danger. Okay, so another thing we're going to talk about here is the 3 different types of contraction. Okay, and there's 3 different types, and I've been talking about these some already. They're called concentric, eccentric, and isometric. Okay, and so a concentric contraction is a contraction where muscle is shortening. An eccentric contraction is a contraction where muscle is lengthening. And then isometric is a contraction where muscle is contracting, but there's no movement happening in the joint. Okay, so we can kind of visualize that by this preview question here, which would be picture yourself on a bench press. Okay, so you're laying down on your back. You got that bar up above your head on the rack. And we're going to try 3 different ways to lift that bar, and we're going to see which one you can lift the most weight with. Okay, so the first option is you start with the bar on your chest all the way down, okay? And all you have to do is lift all the way up. That's all you got to do, okay? That's for A, okay? Option B, start with the bar all the way up on the rack and then lower it all the way down to your chest. And that's all you got to do. Okay, and then somebody else helps you pick it back up. And then option C is you start right in the middle. Somebody helps you lower it down right to the middle, and then you just hold it there for 10 seconds with no movement. Okay, and so let me explain this to you in terms of those contractions. This one represents concentric. Okay, A represents concentric, B represents eccentric, and C represents isometric. Okay, so you can think about which one you think can produce the most force, and I'm not going to give you the answer right now, but we'll make sure we address it as we move forward. Okay, so again, we've got this example, these three types of contraction. Concentric, that's shortening muscle, eccentric, that's lengthening, and then isometric, that's no movement. Okay, iso means the same, right? Okay, so as the slide says, we've got the eccentric contraction can produce 50% more force than either of the other two contractions. Okay, so if we look at this example of the bicep curl, we have this one just coming up, this one just going down, and this one, and this one not moving at all. C not moving at all. Okay, so which one can produce the most force? Well, again, this one is your concentric, this one is your eccentric, and this one is your isometric. So if we said eccentric can produce 50% more force, then B is going to be the correct answer, not C. Sorry, I circled that one. Okay, so that's an important piece. So if we go back to this question here, which was the correct answer? Well, again, it's B. Okay, eccentric produces way more force. And so the deal with that is we're using the maximal ability of actin and myosin. Okay, so we got max actin myosin. But then also the other very important part of muscle contraction is this extra force produced by the elastic properties of muscle. So when we stretch a muscle fully, then we get extra tension in the muscle by the fact that some of these proteins inside the muscle are elastic and they want to bounce back, they want to spring back. So that puts a lot more tension on the muscle, and that's how we get so much force out of those eccentric contractions. So which one leads the most soreness? If you do something that doesn't have any eccentric activity, like for example ride a bike, you won't really get that sore. Okay, so you have to be weight bearing, have to do weight bearing activity in order to do eccentric contractions, and that's when you get the most sore. So when you get the most sore is when you do something like downhill, right? So downhill running, right? Or we got just walking downhill, or doing just negatives in the gym, right? Where you're just lowering and not raising it back up. So eccentric contractions create the most soreness because they put so much tension on the muscle, and there's a little bit of damage caused in the muscle. And what causes that soreness is the inflammation that comes in to try to repair that damage. Okay, so to summarize this, which joint position creates the most force? And really I'm just going to let you guys fill this in, okay? Because this is a summary for you to kind of go back and fill this in your notes. So I'm not going to fill this in for you here, but you can use the notes to fill this summary in. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit here and talk about something called a motor unit, okay? A very important definition here is a motor unit, okay? So the definition of a motor unit is all of the muscle fibers, okay? Also known as cells, right? All the muscle cells or fibers that are innervated by one single motor neuron, okay? And so that's shown here up on top. So we've got the axon of motor neuron number 1. That one's red, okay? So it's the axon coming down. It comes down and interacts with 3 different muscle cells, right? So when we activate this red motor neuron here, okay, when we activate this red one, it's going to come down. It's going to contract all 3 of these muscle cells no matter what. We can't just say, oh, we just want to do this one, but not these 2. Now, if one of these muscle cells gets activated, then all 3 of them do. Okay, that's all within that one motor unit. But we don't have to also contract motor neuron number 2. We can just do one at a time. Okay, We can do them both at the time if we want, but they're separate. So motor unit number 1 is with motor neuron number 1, and then motor unit number 2 is with motor neuron number 2. And you can see this one, motor neuron number 2 is connected to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 muscle fibers, right? And so when that blue one is activated, all 5 of those muscle fibers contract at once. And so that's a motor unit. Okay, so each muscle consists of many different motor units. In each motor unit, there's a range of how many muscle cells we find. So some motor units have a very small number. Okay, those would be motor units that are specialized for fine control, low force production. Okay, so think of the muscles in your face, in your tongue, in your eyes, even in your fingers that allow you to write. We want to do very small, precise movements there, but not produce a lot of force. So we only want to use a few muscle cells at a time. So those would be small motor units. Okay. And then we have some that have many cells. Okay, and these would be coarse movements, high force. So think about muscles you'd use to jump, or to kick a ball, or to throw a ball. Right. So intense, powerful movements that need a lot of force, but not necessarily perfect precision. Okay. So some examples of each, some large motor units. We have large motor units in muscles, muscles like the soleus. This is not that large, but somewhat large. It has about 180 fibers per motor unit. Okay, that might seem pretty big, but it's kind of more mid-range, more of a postural muscle, so it doesn't produce a lot of force rapidly. But then the other, so the soleus is one of your calf muscles. Okay. It's the one behind your other calf muscle you can see. And then the gastrocnemius is the other calf muscle that's more there for jumping, sprinting, produces a lot of force rapidly. So the average motor unit here is 1,000 to 2,000 muscle cells per motor unit. So lots of force real rapidly. And then real small muscles in our fingers and our eyes, we may have as little as 3 muscle cells per motor unit. So we can do very fine movements. Okay, and most of our muscles have a mix of some small ones and then some large ones, so they can do a range of things. Okay, so some information potential here. We build up a little bit of tension. It starts to decline, but before it goes all the way back to resting, we get another one. So it pops back up. It can build off of that tension that was already there. Okay, it starts to go back down, but before it gets all the way down, we get another action potential that can build up again, right? And this keeps happening until we get a good amount of force production here at the top. Okay, what this is called is a lower frequency stimulus. Okay, so higher than what we just had before, because last time it was just one stimulus, but now we have stimuli, multiple stimuli, but they're still kind of spread apart a little ways, right? So that would be a low frequency stimulus, and we get partial relaxation, but not full relaxation. So we can build on that tension, and this is called unfused or incomplete tetanus. Okay, and then our last option here is really what happens most of the time when we contract a muscle, which is we have high frequency stimulation, so lots of action potentials all arriving at once. You see tension builds. There's really no time for relaxation at all. Tension is just building, building, building until it gets to maximum tension that's going to happen. And then it just stays there because the stimuli continue, right? Stimuli are just going, going, going. So there's no time for relaxation, so that tension stays all the way until the stimuli stop, and then the tension is going to come back down, right? And this is called tetanus. This is called the tetanus or tetanic contraction, where all of those stimuli are just fused, all those twitches are fused together, and we get lots of force production, nice smooth contraction. Okay? And this is really what happens with all normal muscle contraction that you do in your body when you're trying to do some kind of useful movement. It's going to be fused or complete tetanus. Okay. All right, so I'll let you guys recap this on your own. Okay, and then one other concept that's important to understand with producing force in muscle is how we can vary how much force comes from a muscle, right? So we can use a muscle like our let's talk about our pectoralis major muscle. It's a large muscle in our chest. We can use that muscle. I can use that muscle to reach across and and grab Eve's face and kind of caress the side of her face, right? Maybe kind of rub her head in a very soft, gentle fashion, right? I'm using my pec to reach across and do that. Or I could also use my pec to throw a punch, right? To swing as hard as I can and punch a punching bag as hard as I can, right? Same muscle, but obviously my brain knows how to modulate the amount of force produced by that muscle and come out with a very different result. Okay, so there's three things that control how much force is produced by a muscle and how we modulate that force. So those three things are the number of motor units that we use in the muscle. Secondly is the size of the muscle cells in the motor units contracted. And then third is the length-tension relationship, where we started in that length-tension relationship in each fiber. Okay, so number one, let's talk about stimulus strength. Okay, so the stronger the stimulus is that comes to the area of the brain that controls my pectoralis major muscle, right? There's a whole little area in my brain that's all the motor neurons for my pectoralis major, okay? And so when I think about contracting my pectoralis major, if I just want to do it a little bit, then that stimulus is not as strong. That would be the caressing Eve's face versus wanting to swing that punch as hard as I can, then that stimulus would be very strong. Okay, and so what happens there is the stronger that stimulus is that comes to that part of my brain, the more motor units I'm going to use. Okay, so for example, a very low threshold, a very low stimulus would be here. It doesn't even actually reach the threshold, so no motor units contract. Okay, so this is shown here. This would be like that whole muscle, and each little dot represents a motor unit that's being used, so none of them are being used there. A little bit stronger stimulus in 2, still not high enough to reach the threshold. Now, number 3, we finally reach the threshold, so we're contracting 2 motor units there, right? And then as that stimulus gets stronger, okay, we go up to, all right, now we've got more motor units, even more, and then finally we get to the point where that stimulus is so strong that we're using all the motor units in that muscle. And then even if the stimulus got stronger, it doesn't really matter because we're already tapped out. We've used all of the motor units, okay? And this is going to correspond with how much tension is being produced in the muscle, right? So no tension, a little bit of tension, and then it works its way up to that maximal contraction, and then it stays there, right? So the number of motor units contracted within a muscle is going to depend on the strength of the stimulus being sent from the brain. Okay, so we're just thinking of strong stimulus versus weak stimulus, and that's going to go from the brain through the spinal cord, and then that tells the spinal cord how many motor neurons to fire, which then results in how many motor units to fire. Okay, so that's number one. Stimulus strength is going to dictate number of motor units used. Okay, secondly, we have something in our muscles and in our motor units called the size principle. Okay, size principle means that when we go back to that low frequency or low stimulus, that smaller stimulus, the first motor units are going to be contracted with that low intensity stimulus are always the smallest ones. Okay, the ones that have the smallest muscle cells. Okay, so motor unit 1 recruited is very small muscle fibers. Okay. The next one up, once we get a little bit stronger stimulus, we're going to contract some more motor units. Those ones are a little bit bigger. Okay, you can see those cells are a little bit bigger, so medium fibers. And then we get all the way up to the largest muscle fibers. When we have that real strong stimulus, we're going to use those large muscle fibers. Okay, and that's the way this always works. So with that low frequency, that low intensity stimulus, we're not producing a lot of force because we're not using very many muscle cells and very many motor units, but also because within those motor units, the cells are small. Okay, and then as the stimulus strength gets stronger, the cells get larger. All right, so it's not only that we're using more cells, but also larger cells. And that's really the big deal with muscles, is the larger it is, the more force it produces. Okay, so more cells and also larger cells as stimulus increases in strength. Okay, so how does the body control how hard a muscle contracts? And that example I just gave, arm, hand muscles can lightly caress or it can violently punch, right? So which ones apply here? Well, we can think about this. Like we just talked about, definitely the number of muscle cells being stimulated is true, okay? The size of the muscle cells being stimulated, that's definitely true. That's part of the size principle. The strength of the electrical signal sent from the nervous system, for sure. That's going to be what dictates. This dictates number of motor units used, right? So definitely that one too. The number of motor neurons being stimulated, for sure, because because that strength of the electrical signal is going to, so signal strength will dictate the number of motor neurons being used, and the number of neurons being used dictates the number of motor units used. So all of these are true. All right, guys. Thanks for listening. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday for our next TBL day.